At least one Palestinian has been killed and more than 200 injured in Gaza protests, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. At least 20,000 Palestinians gathered to commemorate the anniversary of last year's March of Returns protests. As Michael Holmes explains, despite the violence, today's protests are being seen as largely peaceful.
Fred, Israeli forces are still firing tear gas at some of the stragglers in the field behind me near the fence. There has been some incoming canisters in just the last few minutes, but it is much calmer here than it was earlier in the day. The crowds have largely gone home. Earlier there were tens of thousands of people along the fence between Israel and Gaza. Now, for Hamas, this was a test that they could turn out large numbers of people for this anniversary protest, but also a test to show that they had the ability to keep that crowd under control and limit the number of casualties. And in fact, it does appear that that has worked. Casualty numbers way below what they have been in other weeks of this protest. Hamas trying to show to Israel they were controlling the people, Israel watching closely to see how that was done and how effective it was. Earlier in the day, as the thousands of protesters were here and going closer to the fence, there were warning shots and there was a lot of tear gas being fired, but very, very few injuries compared to other protests. Now the hard work begins. Egypt mediating those talks between Hamas and Israel and trying to come to some sort of understanding going forward, alleviating restrictions here in Gaza, allowing more goods and services in, more electricity, more diesel, things like that, and Hamas in return keeping things quiet here on the Gaza Strip, and that includes protests like the one today and rocket fire into Israel as well. Now that the protest is over and has been largely effective in terms of being quiet when it comes to casualty numbers and violence, we'll see how those talks progress. Back to you, Fred.
Michael Holmes, thank you so much. So much more straight ahead in the newsroom right after this.
Welcome to BBC World News. Palestinian officials say at least 2 Palestinians have been killed as thousands of protesters gathered on the boundary between Gaza and Israel to mark 1 year since weekly demonstrations started there. They've been calling for Israel to allow refugees back into the homes their families fled when the State of Israel was created in 1948, as well as for the easing of the blockade on Gaza. The UN says at least 190 Palestinians and an Israeli soldier were killed between March and December of last year. Israeli sources say Hamas, which called today's protest, appears to have tried to limit violence. Our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman has travelled to one of the protest areas in Gaza. He sent us this report.
We're at the biggest protest site just east of Gaza City, and as we were driving in, we saw thousands of Palestinians making their way towards the site here. That's a tear gas canister being thrown back by one of the protesters. You can see the Israeli points on the other side of the perimeter fence. These are sniper positions. And what we're seeing at the moment is tear gas being fired at the Palestinian protesters. Some of the protesters are burning tyres. So far, they haven't made their way right up to the fence. And that is the real point of friction here. What today will be a test, I think, of what has been a very fragile calm between Hamas, that runs the Gaza Strip, and Israel in these last few days after a serious military escalation at the start of the week. And as these protests, these year anniversary protests get underway, there has been strong rhetoric from both sides. The Israelis have sent 200 snipers at sniper positions around the fence and 3 extra brigades to the south of Israel, to the area surrounding the Strip. As for Hamas, well, it has asked people to remain peaceful, but it says if there is what it calls Israeli aggression, it will respond with equal force.
Tom Bateman there. Well, our correspondent Yolande Nell is in southern Israel on the other side of the boundary and gave us this update.
Well, here in Nahal Oz, if you look across through the field, you can see the Gaza boundary fence, and we can still see on the other side large Palestinian crowds. According to the Israeli military, some 40,000 Palestinians turned out at different locations along the fence for this day of protests. Despite the relatively large numbers of protesters, we have seen less violence than in previous weeks. Israeli troops here have been mainly using tear gas that we've seen to drive people back, and they have had claims from the UN, from a UN inquiry, that they've used excessive force in the past using live ammunition. They say that they only use live ammunition when Palestinians are trying to breach the fence, enter Israeli territory where they could pose a threat to Israeli civilians who live really, as we've seen in Nahal Oz, not very far away at all from the place where all of these protests are taking place. There's been no Israeli confirmation of a claim that came from Hamas suggesting that they had been helped by Egypt to reach a sort of deal with Israel whereby they would calm things along the fence in return for an easing of the tough economic sanctions that are imposed on Gaza. But all of this really coming at a very sensitive time where Hamas has been trying to use this anniversary as kind of a show of force. It wants also to use the anniversary as leverage with Israel. It's been facing a lot of economic unrest in Gaza with some unprecedented protests there and people turning their criticism on the Hamas leadership. Here in Israel, it's also a very sensitive time politically. We're just 10 days away from a general election where security really is a main issue. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu doesn't want to be shown to be making any concessions to Hamas militants, but at the same time, he doesn't want to be fighting an unpredictable campaign against Palestinian militants at the same time as he's fighting a tough election campaign.